American politics is not linear. History, at least in many ways in the United States, is not linear. And one of the ways it's not linear is that we have cyclical patterns in U.S. electoral history. We go through periods where one party tends to dominate the political process. And that's what you see on this chart. Ever since the founding of the American two-party system way back in 1828 by Andrew Jackson and the early Democrats, we have gone through periods where one party wins about 3/4 of the presidential elections contested during that era. And that's what we are reflecting here, using the familiar red state, blue state. The eras where the Republicans won are in red, the ones where the Democrats won are in blue. And you can see pretty much across the board, it's gone usually where one party dominates an era for about 40 years, then the next party comes along and dominates, and they just keep changing back and forth throughout U.S. history. We're hoping, maybe against hope, but we will see that the small little dot at the end there is a blue dot or a blue square, and that will forecast the rise of the next era, which will be a Democratic era. What happens in these eras is that there is a situation of party coalitions which remain stable during these entire periods. Voting blocks remain the same, the familiar red state, blue state. If I name a state like Utah, you'll say it's a red state. If I name another one like Massachusetts, you'll say it's a blue state, and that remains very stable, and public policy remains very stable. What causes these to end, and they do end inevitably after about 36 to 40 years, are two things. One is the political emergence, the political coming of age of a brand new large generation. It has to be large enough to overwhelm all the other generations before it, and it has to be dynamic. It has to have a certain zeitgeist, a certain way of looking at the world, interacting with the world, that leads it in an outward direction, leads it to focus on the political process, and leads it to make change. And secondly, there is the emergence of a new communication technology that generation uses better than any other generation. That generation can use it to mobilize itself. Others can use it to mobilize the generation. But those two things, every 40 years, cause this sharp realignment, which then sets in motion another 36 to 40 year era of political stability. The last realignment in American history, or as we refer to it as a makeover, was brought about by the baby boomer generation. That's a generation that was born, and many of the people in this room are baby boomers, I'm sure, but a generation that was born between 1946 and 1964. They led the last political realignment in America, and they are characterized by two things. One, their large size, but even more important is the fact that this is what we refer to as an idealist generation. It's a generation driven by its own, the members of it are driven by their own internal moral beliefs, their sense of right and wrong, and they try to enact those moral beliefs through the political process. Usually these generations are large, but they're also divided. And because they are highly divided, because you have people on the left, people on the right in these generations, the members of the generation don't always get along very well with one another. In fact, usually don't get along, so they bang heads against each other, and what we see is 35 to 40 years of political gridlock like we've seen. The previous realignment to the baby boomer realignment in 1968 was brought about by the GI generation, or what Tom Brokaw referred to as the greatest generation. They were born between 1901 and 1924, but a very different kind of generation, because we refer to the GI generation and the millennials who are coming along as a civic generation. Also large, but and also dynamic, also attempting to enact its will through the political process, but in a different way. It is a generation that is group concerned with the well-being of all the members of the group, seeks win-win solutions to our political problems. And so this generation, instead of being divided, instead of tearing down institutions like the idealist generations, it tends to build up these institutions, wants to use the political process and its institutions to resolve our political problems and our economic problems. And so what we have seen alternating throughout American history is two types of realignments depending on the generation that leads that type of realignment, that realignment. So in 1828, when it was Andrew Jackson against John Quincy Adams, it was an idealist realignment. And this leads to another point. No party is totally idealist, totally civic at any particular point, because even though Jackson, the Democrat, won, it was actually an idealist realignment. Abraham Lincoln led in 1860 a civic realignment for the Republicans. In 1896, William McKinley led another idealist realignment. 1932 was Franklin Roosevelt's turn, only by now the Democrats were the civic party, and that led a civic realignment. And then in 1968, Richard Nixon brought into impact or into effect another idealist realignment. And so you can see in 1968, the last realignment, again, was brought about by a generation, the baby boomer generation, that was highly divided. It was a generation, even though we think of the baby boomers as a liberal generation because of their activities during the anti-Vietnam activities, the women's rights movement, the civil rights movement, actually was a highly divided generation. About equal numbers of liberals and conservatives. Bill Clinton was a baby boomer, is a baby boomer, but so is George W. Bush. And so again, a generation that's highly divided and highly fractured, divided along many times gender lines, ethnic lines, and so the end result is as it tries to enact its moral beliefs is gridlock and deadlock. What happens as a result of this gridlock and deadlock and the clashes is that people tend to have negative attitudes toward government. And so if you look at the chart in the early, and that's 1960s, it's early 1960s, not late 1960s, it's around the election of JFK, you can see that the large majority of people believed that there was a role in government, the government tried to find solutions that were beneficial to the public, the government listened, politicians listened to what the people wanted, and that sort of thing. By 2006, however, very few people believed that. Only about a third believed that the people, rather than special interest, ran things in government, usually get their way in government, and a very alarming number, only 10%, believe that politicians care what ordinary people think about. So as a result of the conflict, as a result of the clashes, people tend to lose faith in government. They just don't believe that government can make things work in the benefit of the public and the benefit of solving problems. This year's realignment, however, is going to change that. It's going to be a civic realignment. And these are the civic realignments we've seen throughout American history. We're taking a bit of liberty about 1776 because, of course, there was no election that year. But there was a civic realignment after all. We broke away from the colonies, broke away from England, and established a new country with its new forms of government. So it was certainly a period of institution building during that era. 1860, again, the same thing. It was a civic realignment. Not only did Abraham Lincoln and the Republicans resolve the issue of slavery, the greatest moral issue of that era, but they also established the idea of federal supremacy, that the federal government policies, laws, institutions were going to be predominant in the United States as opposed to the will of the individual states. 1932, again, another civic realignment, creation of a lot of new institutions of government, and also established the notion that the federal government had a specific role in guiding the economy, a specific role in providing a floor beneath which the economic fortunes of the American working class could not sink. And finally, we believe that 2008 is going to be the fourth civic realignment in U.S. history. Civic realignments result in institution building. They result in the resolution of major political issues. They result in actually developing policies that solve a lot of the problems that have existed throughout our period. One of the things that happens in civic realignments, symbolized by the chart here, is the notion that there is likely to be some sort of economic redistribution. Millennials, as a generation, are very concerned with economic inequality, and we would expect that, among other things, we are going to see policies that are going to deal with issues like economic inequality, deal with issues, finally, like health care and the like. They will also result in this next civic realignment in the reemergence of positive attitudes toward the political process that will look like, at the end of this era, we believe, like the attitudes that people held toward politics and government during the 1950s and early 1960s. So who is going to lead this new realignment? Well, it's going to be the millennial generation. This is a civic generation. These are Americans born between 1982 and 2003. Morley will give you some information about how this generation was formed and how their beliefs developed, but just a little bit about the politics of this generation and what they will bring. First of all, this is a large generation. You can see from the higher birth rates. Not all generations are the same size. Birth rates rise and fall. So among the baby boomers, there was obviously high birth rates. It declined for Generation X during the late 60s through the early 1980s, and then has been rising ever since for the millennials. They are a very diverse generation. 40% are non-white. 20% have at least one immigrant as a parent. They are the first generation in at least 2 or 3 to have more people calling themselves liberal or progressive than conservative. And you can see on the other side, most of the largest number of people among the baby boomers, there were more conservatives than liberals. The millennials, it's by almost a 2-to-1 ratio, liberals over conservatives. They are also a democratic generation. There's a notion that all young people are radical, all young people are liberal, they'll change as they grow older. That isn't the case. 2002, all those young people, 18 to 29, they were all Gen Xers. And the two political parties and identification were essentially tied. And in fact, there were slightly more Republicans than Democrats among young people. By 2004, as the first millennials came into the electorate, the Democrats had a very small margin. By 2007, when this survey was conducted, the millennials had about a 1.75 to 1 advantage. And if things continue at the rate they're going, it's going to reach 2 to 1 by the next midterm elections. And finally, and maybe most important, this is a generation, like all civic generations, that votes. The lower bar is, the lower graph is young voters and older voters. And you can see that while younger voters have tended to vote at a lower rate than older voters at all points, by 2004, when the first millennials were coming in, you can see the line kind of ticking up for younger voters. We would expect that in 2008, the figures we've seen is that younger voters are actually voting at about the same ratio now as their elders. GIs back in the 1930s actually outvoted, younger voters actually outvoted older voters. So a more democratic, a more liberal, and a more active generation. And with that in mind, I will turn it over to Morley, who can tell you how it all happened.